Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Mill Valley Outdoor Art Club Speaker Series. I'm Lynn Fabian Lassner, the Cultural Arts Chair, and I'm also a big fan of sharing engaging stories like the ones you'll hear today. Jeff Greenwald, our guest, is the author of 9 books, including Shopping for Buddhas, now in its 25th anniversary edition, The Size of the World, for which he created the very first internet blog, travel blog, and Snake Lake. His tales and essays appear in many print and online publications. During his 45-year writing career, he's profiled a full spectrum of global luminaries, including the Dalai Lama, Grace Slick, Paul Bowles, and William Shatner. His adventures at home and in more than 100 foreign lands have provided rich material for Jeff's storytelling career, and his compelling tales have been featured at The Moth and on NPR's Snap Judgment. His one-man show, Strange Travel Suggestions, premiered in San Francisco in 2003, and he also works as a freelance editor specializing in travel and memoir. Jeff's most recent books include Out of Nothing, Conversations with Larry Harvey, and 9 Gifts, co-authored with Christine Marie Mason. His current work in progress, which we'll see today, is 108 Beloved Objects and is available in book form in a limited edition run. So please email Jeff if you are interested in any or all of the above books and in today's presentation, which is in book form. And you can email him at jeff@jeffgreenwald.com, which we will have in the chat box to buy any of his books. Please type any of your questions, not into the chat box, however, but into the Q&A because it's easier for everyone to manage. So it'll say Q&A below your Zoom screen, and use that for any questions you might have. And we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of this presentation. So in introduction, my question is, what does an ethical traveler and travel writer like Jeff do when COVID protocols squash his assignments? Well, Jeff decided to take an inward journey around his own Oakland flat. He picked out 108 objects which evoked his own personal passages. He made a decision to part with those objects, but not to part with their stories. So here he is today, enriching our lives with the show we are about to witness, called 108 Beloved Objects by Jeff Greenwald.
Thank you, Lynn, for that wonderful introduction. Everybody see me okay? Am I clear? Am I present? Yeah, well, I want to thank Lynn and Kathleen and Robin for inviting me to give this little presentation to you today. And since it's based on a book, I'm going to occasionally be reading things and then talking extemporaneously. I want to give you a little introduction first to what this book is about. And it all goes back, well, it goes back a lot further than this, but my favorite story takes place in the 1780s, when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were diplomats in London. And during their time there, they went to visit Shakespeare's old home on Stratford-on-Avon. And they were let in. It wasn't a big tourist site at that time. They just went in and started looking around, and they got up to the writing room where Shakespeare had written so many of his famous plays. And they both kind of looked at each other, reached into their pockets, took out their pocket knives, and started whittling away at the chair that Shakespeare had sat in when he wrote those plays. They wanted to each take home a little piece of Shakespeare's chair, as if it were like a piece of the true cross or something. You know, this has happened all over the world in so many places. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Plymouth Rock, the first place where the Pilgrims landed in the United States, off Massachusetts, up until fairly recently, the local grocery store rented hammers to visitors so they could come up and chip off pieces of the rock to take home. It's just this crazy compulsion we all have to collect keepsakes of our travels and of our lives and of our friendships and of our loves, wherever we go and whatever we're doing. So why do we do this? Why do we collect these things? Well, I think that these items, these objects, they remind us that they were there, that we were there. They remind us of our presence in a place, the way that like no selfie ever can. We know that time is always flying by, but if we can bring back an object that keeps us in that moment, it's like putting our finger in the dike of time. So we kind of collect these things to ground us in our own history, to slow us down. But during the pandemic, all of us, me included, have learned a sort of different lesson, which is how to let go of things that are just taking up real estate in our lives and don't really bring us any great fulfillment anymore. I live in Oakland, and I remember through the first year of the pandemic, the results of this decluttering were everywhere, just out on the curbs. There were just piles of books and clothes and toys and trophies and furniture, office supplies, strollers, toaster ovens. It was just an unending cornucopia of stuff that was kind of left out by the curb. It was like where people were flushing their lives clean of all the objects they've collected, or at least of a lot of them. But getting rid of stuff, it isn't always easy. It's kind of like, do you remember the movie Toy Story? I think it was Toy Story 3 when they're trying to give the toys away or something to a Goodwill. The toys don't want to go. You know, they're reluctant to go. They're objects, but they all have their own stories, and they don't want to leave until they can be sure that at least their stories will live on after them. And that is what this presentation and my new book is all about: letting go of stuff, but keeping our stories. So my book, it's called 108 Beloved Objects, and it fits with this new practice that so many of us have taken up, letting go of stuff. So during my life and travels, I've gathered a cornucopia of keepsakes. Some are valuable, some are worthless to anyone but me, you know, some are somewhere in between. And I decided to give them away, but I needed to limit the number of things I gave away. And that's because I suffer very slightly but noticeably from OCD. And this like often comes out when I'm washing the dishes. I'll go to the sink, it'll be full of dishes. I don't have a dishwasher. And I'll say to myself, I can't handle this infinite number of dishes. I'll wash 47 dishes and then I'll call it quits. So with this book, I decided to do the same thing. I would find and give away 108 objects from my life and then stop and pause and think about what I've done. Why 108? Well, some of you who are versed in Asian culture aware that 108 is the number of beads on a Tibetan Buddhist prayer mala. It's the number of yoga positions, asanas, in a full sun cycle. And it just so happens, I found out after I'd already started the book, that there are 108 stitches on a baseball. So it's kind of a crazy coincidence. So I picked that number and I ran with it. There's 108 objects in my book. Each one has a story that's 1 page long. I'm not going to give you a choice of all 108 objects in this presentation. That's too many to fit on a Zoom screen. So I picked kind of my favorite 16 objects whose stories I love, and they'll come up randomly on this grid. I don't know if you see the grid yet, but once you do, we will activate it, and then we will begin our stories. So take it away. Okay, so while I was at UC Santa Cruz for about 1975 to 1977, I lived in a house on Cayuga Street, splitting the $300 a month rent with 4, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, sometimes as many as 12 housemates. By the way, the object, if you haven't seen it already on your screen, is a bamboo camera that I bought in Fiji in 2006, one of the objects in the book. So the core group of us who lived on the house Cayuga Street included my best friend, Brian. And Brian was a history major. He was a total rabble rouser. And he taught me rock climbing. And then, like sort of as his triumph, he overcame his gigantic fear of spiders and built us a dark room in our web-riddled basement. So then at that point, he taught me how to take pictures, how to develop film, and how to print using the enlarger that he brought over from his parents' home in Washington. So I started taking pictures. I started going through the whole darkroom thing, and photography became one of my life's greatest passions. Well, the grandmaster of photography at that time was, of course, Ansel Adams. And when I learned he lived only 75 miles south on the rugged Monterey coast, I decided to look up his number. And you could do that in those days. You could just open up the phone book and look up Ansel Adams, and there was his phone number. So I just picked up the phone, called him on our rotary phone, and I just dialed, and he picked up the phone, and I said, "Hi, Ansel, my name is Jeff Greenwald. I'm a photographer at UC Santa Cruz. I'd love to meet you one day." And he said, "Come on down. We're having a little gathering this evening. I'd love to see you." So I got on my motorcycle, which was a Honda CB30, one of my favorite motorcycles I ever owned. And when I arrived, somebody, his daughter Virginia, led me into the living room. And she took from me a portfolio I was carrying. I'd actually brought down a dozen of what I thought were my best 11 by 14 photographs. So there were a number of other guests. Everybody seemed at home. I was handed a glass of red wine. It was a gorgeous home with all Ansel Adams' best photography prints all over the walls, and a cloudless Pacific sunset filled the room's gigantic picture window. Ansel Adams was 74 at that time, and he occupied a comfortable chair kind of in the middle of the room, holding court. He motioned me over. "We're waiting for the green flash," he said with a grin. "I'm going to watch the sun until the moment it disappears beneath the horizon, and then the rest of you might be able to see the green flash. I'm sacrificing seeing the green flash," he noted, "for all of you." Now, I don't know if you know what the green flash is. If the sun sets over a flat landscape like the ocean and there's no clouds, sometimes a second or two after the sun vanishes below the horizon, you can see a sort of flash of green fire illuminating the sky. And this is what we were watching for. So we all sat there. Ansel watched the sun, kind of, fatiguing his retinas while the big ball of the sun sank below the Pacific. And we waited. He said, "Look now at the sun." And we looked up, and predictably, as always, there was no green flash. Anyway, that was a little sad, but Ansel Adams did agree to look at the pictures that I had brought. And he sat down, he said, "Bring over your portfolio." And I opened them up and I started going through them one by one. He was so gracious, he actually even took one of my photographs for himself and gave me a small print of his own. Well, those were the days. I was young and cheeky, and I truly believed in myself, and you had really better starting out. But the other day, I pulled that portfolio of photographs down from the shelf of my closet, and I looked at them with the benefit of hindsight, and I was devastated. They were absolutely terrible. They might as well have been taken with this bamboo camera. That's our first story. I guess we've got to get on to another story. Let's see. Let's get the grid going again. Hey, I'm not doing that story again. Try it again. Okay, that is a statue of the Tibetan god Avalokiteshvara, which I bought in Nepal in 1990. So he's known by many names in Buddhist and Hindu cultures the world over. Avalokiteshvara, as a female deity, he's known as Kuan Yin, Chenrezig. This is the god that you see who has like 1,000 arms, who's the god of never-ending compassion in the Tibetan pantheon. And Chenrezig, this god, Avalokiteshvara, they're the same, is what's known as a bodhisattva. He's a being who has gone through all the cycles of suffering that life has to offer and attained the point where he can extinguish himself into nirvana and never be troubled by those, slings and arrows of a human lifetime again. But a bodhisattva does not choose the option of nirvana. They decide to be reborn on earth over and over again, to be of service until all their fellow human beings are released of suffering. So in 1996, I had the good fortune to spend an hour interviewing Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, at his home in Dharamsala, India. Now, the Dalai Lama, as many of you I'm sure know, is revered by the Tibetan people as a direct reincarnation of Chenrezig himself. The subject of our meeting, the reason I'd gotten this interview, was because we were going to discuss popular science, specifically as it applied to Star Trek, which I learned was one of the Dalai Lama's great passions when he was a young man and had just fled to India watching Star Trek on TV. So our interview appears in my book, Future Perfect, How Star Trek Conquered Planet Earth. But there's one anecdote, there's a story of something that happened during that interview with the Dalai Lama that is not in the book. And that's the little story I want to tell you right now. So I was brought into the altar room at the Dalai Lama's residence in Dharamsala, India. And I sat down on a couch. It was a very simple room. There was one couch sort of, on one side, another couch at an L shape with it. And then in between the two couches in the corner formed by the L was a small table. So I put my notebook and my pen on that small table, and then someone called my name and I stood up, and the Dalai Lama walked into the room. Very, very radiant being, a tremendous sense of presence and spiritual charisma about him. I walked up to him, he took my shoulders, I took his. We bumped heads, which is the traditional Tibetan greeting, and then I put a silk kata scarf around his neck. And we both sat down, but as the Dalai Lama sat down in his chair on the couch across from me, he swept his maroon robe over his shoulder. And as the robe sort of moved through the air, it swept across the little table between us, and it knocked my pen off the table, and my pen went flying across the room and across the couch opposite from the two of us. It just rolled over under the couch and disappeared. Before I could move or utter a word of protest, the Dalai Lama had leaped off of his couch and onto the floor. His arm and shoulder disappeared under the other couch, stirring up a whole cloud of dust bunnies. Your Holiness, I cried, Your Holiness, get up, I'll get the pen. And from under the couch, I just heard his very distinctive booming voice saying, "No, no, no, it is my responsibility." He emerged a few minutes later, completely covered with dust, with a huge smile on his face and my pen in his hand. And I felt like I'd learned more about the Dalai Lama in that moment than I had from reading any of the books that I'd read about him or his escape from Tibet. I tried to imagine then Pope John Paul II in the same situation. It was impossible. Well, this 19-inch tall statue of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara has stood on my bedroom dresser for 30 years. And it serves to remind me every single day of that moment with the Dalai Lama and of the meaning of the word humility. Okay, I think we're ready for our next object. Ooh, this is a beautiful plastic dove covered with Islamic calligraphy, which I picked up in 1999, and I will tell you where. First, I'm going to have a little sip of water. It's tough on stage under all these spotlights because it gets really, really warm. So it's difficult to find souvenirs when you're in Iran. One searches for that irresistible blend of beauty, authenticity, and kitsch. But as any visitor to an Islamic country really knows, the most beautiful, elegant sort of manifestation of the Islamic religion is the calligraphy. This plastic dove bears on it verses from the Quran, along with a single Arabic expression on its chest, which I don't know how many of you can read Arabic, but if you can look at the dove's chest, there's the word Masha'Allah, which means what wonders God has willed, Mashallah. I had hoped for an opportunity to utter this phrase in the 1,000-year-old Iranian city of Isfahan, where, as the only American in vast Imam Khomeini Square, I awaited a total eclipse of the sun. It was August 1999, a beautiful afternoon, warm and clear, and the square that I was in, Imam Khomeini Square, soon filled up with Iranian families, thousands of them with their lunches, with musical instruments, with their cameras, just like you'd find here. It was sort of like an Arabian Woodstock in a way. And as the invisible moon began to move across the sky, across the face of the sun, the crowd gradually became silent. I'm sure all of you have seen at least a partial solar eclipse, and you know that moment when the moon just starts moving across the face of the sun. Oh, my hand's getting eclipsed. The moon starts moving across the face of the sun, and a little bite of the sun is taken out. And it's just really, really extremely beautiful. But I don't know how many of you are aware that just as the Jewish flag of the flag of Israel has the Star of David on it, and the Christian flag is symbolized by a cross, the sign on the Islamic flag is a crescent moon, symbolizing the day when Muhammad completed his hijra in the desert and emerged to preach his doctrine. That holiday is celebrated by Islamic people. It's known as the holiday of Eid. So at a certain point, with the earth moving across, with the moon moving across the face of the sun, what was left of the sun resembled just the exact shape of that crescent moon on the Iranian flag. And at that moment, all of the women, the tens of thousands of women sitting in this enormous square watching the eclipse, all took out their compact makeup mirrors, their powder mirrors, and they began reflecting images of the crescent sun all over the nearby walls and mosques and buildings, so that you had thousands of dancing crescent suns on all sides of the square. It was absolutely beautiful. And as that happened, there was scattered applause through the crowd. And then this cry just sort of spontaneously rose up from the crowd, mashallah, mashallah, what wonders God has willed. Well, as the crescent got even thinner and thinner and thinner, something completely unexpected happened. About 50 feet from me, a group of young Iranian men, all of them with beards and traditional Iranian hats, not like this one, zipped open carpet bags, and they began to pull out automatic weapons and American flags. They rose to their feet, began chanting anti-American slogans and burning the American flags right there in this completely crowded square. And at that moment, the most amazing thing that has ever happened to me in my life of travel occurred. Every single one of the Iranians sitting around me, and we hadn't introduced ourselves, they didn't know I was an American, they didn't even know my name, but all of them, men, women, and children, as if on a silent signal, put down whatever they were doing, stood to their feet, and moved to surround me in a donut of protection, in a donut of humanity. There were dozens of people, and I don't remember all of them, but I do remember three. I remember a woman standing on my left side, and though she couldn't touch me to reassure me, and I certainly couldn't put a hand on her, she just looked at me with these eyes of just like pure defiance, like as if to say, we've got your back. And on my right, a young boy, I think he must have been around 8, grabbed 2 of the fingers of my right hand. And he just sort of stood there holding my hand like that and peering up at me as if to say to the crowd, to these zealots, if they want to get you, they have to go through me first. And then right behind me, an elderly man put a hand on my shoulder, and he kind of leaned over and whispered in my ear. He pointed, and he said, "You see those guys burning the flags over there?" Yes, I said, I did see them. Well, they should get a job. That was his offering to me. And then the American flags were all burned up, and the guns ran out of blanks. And what did these crazy zealots do? They put the rifles back in their carpet bags, zipped them up, sat down, put on their eclipse watching glasses, and sat there to enjoy the eclipse with the rest of us. So as the sun finally disappeared behind the moon, and its fiery corona blazed against the stars. At that point, truly a spontaneous cry rose up from the crowd, and I joined in. Mashallah, mashallah. because there's no other thing no other way to express the sight of the solar corona burning in the black sky when moments ago the entire world had been filled with light. And then the moon moved a little further and a tiny bit of the sun peeked through and the whole world was ablaze with light again. And all the families had moved back to their blankets. They all got up and packed and began to leave. A few of them nodded to me, but none of them really said anything, and they all kind of left. And I had this kind of revelation at that moment. And I realized that for all these Iranian families in Imam Khomeini Square that afternoon, that day of their lives, with their children, with their lunches, with their instruments, had been an extraordinary experience seeing a solar eclipse. For me personally, that entire afternoon and even the solar eclipse had really been about the astonishing Iranians and how they had protected me in that really strange and scary moment. Back to the grid. Okay, this incense burner is something I bought in Kathmandu, Nepal in 1979. And it reminds me of a story that I happen to really, really love. So my family moved from Arlington, Massachusetts to Plainview, Long Island in 1963. I was 10 years old. There was almost nothing I liked and very little I remember about growing up on Long Island. On special weekends, though, my parents would make a trip to the huge enclosed flea market at Roosevelt Field. And this was like built near the same airstrip from which Charles Lindbergh had begun his nonstop transatlantic flight in 1927. The vendors at Roosevelt Field sold mainly purses and clothes and costume jewelry, packaged food and knickknacks. It was a great place for kids to wander around. My default destination was a display of incense burners and boxes of cone incense, sandalwood, pine, and rose. For some reason, these incenses obsessed me. The exotic scents were kind of like trading cards. I wanted to collect them all, every single flavor. And even on my limited allowance, I was able to get like 6 or 7 boxes. So there I was, 10 years old and 11 years old, burning incense in my bedroom. And then some years later, 5 years later, when I was about 15, I had the chance to visit another place on Long Island that I remember pretty well. And this was a place called the Westbury Music Fair. So the theater had a circular stage, kind of below the seats, that continued turning during the course of a concert. In April of 1968, I had seen the Doors perform there, believe it or not. That's how old I am. I saw the Doors live. And I remember the tickets were $5. A few months later, on his first American tour, Ravi Shankar played at the Westbury Music Fair. And during his concert, there was an incense burner on the stage, and this beautiful otherworldly aroma sort of filled the whole auditorium. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before. It was nothing like those awful kind of cheap incenses I'd bought, at the Roosevelt Field flea market. So after the concert ended, Ravi Shankar and Ala Raka, his tabla player, who lived up in Marin, took their instruments and left the stage. And they were gone. Everyone kind of left the theater. And I kind of sneaked down to the stage to see if there were any bits and pieces, any butts of incense, stick incense, that were left in the incense burner. And I was sort of looking through this dusty ashtray incense burner, finding a few tiny little pieces of incense I could bring home, kind of like, a bum looking for a butt of a cigarette on the road. And I collected 3 or 4 of them. I was kind of leaning over this thing, and then I felt a hand on my shoulder. And I turned around, looked behind me, and there, of course, was Ravi Shankar. And he just kind of looked at me quizzically and he said, "What are you doing, young man?" And I started stammering, and I just explained to myself, I love incense. I've been collecting incense since I was 10. This was the most beautiful incense I'd ever smelled in my life. And he just patted my shoulder and he said, "Just wait here a minute." He walked off and returned a few minutes later with a long foil wrapped package. These were made especially for me in Bangalore, India, he said. Please enjoy them, but only on special occasions. And inside the foil, there were 3 long, beautiful, untouched sticks of Ravi Shankar's personal incense. I lit the final one, the third one, 11 years later, age 25, after returning safely from my first trip to Nepal and India. I'm sure some of you remember these from July 1969, July 20th, the day that Americans first walked on the moon. I used to collect all this space stuff. My brother and I had an enormous collection of space paraphernalia and memorabilia. And this was one of the items among them. So I'm adjusting the screen here. So this may have been a gift from my old friend, Dave McCutcheon. I don't know, he loves space stuff as much as I do. But it reminds me, looking at this plaque reminds me of the afternoon and evening that I spent interviewing astronaut Buzz Aldrin in 1999. I don't know, I don't remember quite how it happened or what the process had been, but Buzz Aldrin had gotten in touch with me and asked me to help him write the speech he was going to give at the National Press Club in 1999 on the 30th anniversary of the moon landing. So I went down to Los Angeles to meet him in his apartment on not on La Brea, on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. He was about 69 at that time. He was a vital, very fit man, white hair, piercing blue eyes. And he shook my hand, you know, really good, strong hand grip at 69, which is almost the age I am right now. I would love to be in his shape. He lived in this wonderful apartment on Wilshire Boulevard, decorated with all of this, the kind of memorabilia I could never have prayed to collect from the moon landings. There was actually a plaster cast of the footprint he'd made in the moon with his own first steps on the lunar surface. The very first steps, of course, had been made by Neil Armstrong a few seconds earlier. And that was something that even to that day, 30 years later, kind of bedeviled poor Buzz Aldrin, that he hadn't been the first person to set foot on the moon. And you know, as a Navy pilot and as the lunar module pilot, he felt it should have been his responsibility. But there's a really good reason Neil Armstrong was the first person to step foot on the moon rather than Buzz Aldrin. And that's because sorry, I'm stammering my words here. That's because Neil Armstrong had been a Lockheed test pilot. He was not a Navy man. Neil Armstrong was a civilian. And it was very important to NASA that the first human being to set foot on the moon's surface be not someone affiliated with the armed forces, but a civilian. And that is why Buzz Aldrin stepped second on the moon. But I didn't want to talk to him about that, and I knew he didn't want to talk about that. So I decided as an opening gambit to ask him, what questions are you most sick of answering? Or what questions you're going to ask the most that sort of irritate you the most? And he said, don't ask me how it felt to walk on the moon, he cautioned me. I'm sick of that question. It's unanswerable. There's no words in the English language to describe how it felt to walk out on the moon. Don't ever ask me that question. So we continued talking, and I was taking notes for the speech he was going to give. And after about an hour, Buzz Aldrin warmed up to me, and he began to tell me a story about how it had felt after he walked on the moon. And this is after he, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins landed in the ocean and were brought over to the USS Hornet, an aircraft carrier that's currently docked along with the quarantine facility in the Oakland shipyard. And they were quarantined there for 3 weeks on the off chance that they might have brought back some kind of virus or weird bug from the moon that they could contaminate the Earth's atmosphere with. Of course, that didn't happen. But there they were, locked away in this trailer, 3 weeks. And during that time, the whole Hornet crew had brought in newsreels for them to watch of what was going on the planet Earth during their landing on the moon. And so they watched these newsreels of crowds in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, crowds in Beijing, Tokyo, crowds in Paris and San Francisco, big crowds all over the world, this global event, an experience shared by millions of people in every corner of the planet. And Buzz looked at me and he said, I remember at one point, Neil Armstrong turned to me and he said, we missed it. We missed it. And it was true. Every single person in the world practically, and every person I've met for the past 30 years has told me exactly where they were at the very moment that Neil Armstrong and I walked on the moon. We were doing it. We were the ones who were at the center of that experience, but we never shared in the experience. It's as if we missed the entire thing. That's that little story about that object. I know a lot of you are familiar with the god Ganesh, the Hindu god Ganesh, the elephant-headed god of good beginnings, the protector of travelers, the protector of thieves, in fact, and the sage of writers who broke off one of his tusks once to finish writing something that was being dictated to him when his pen ran out of ink. So I think you'll all appreciate this story. I took my mother, Rosalind, to India as a gift for her 75th birthday. Okay, so like maybe India wasn't her first choice. But when I present people with options, or so I'm told, if they're restaurants, whether they're restaurants, films, or hikes, I usually manipulate things so that we end up going where I want to go. And in this case, I really wanted to take my mother to India. So they gave her the choice between Mexico and Paris and Antarctica and South Africa and India. You know, I said India with a special accent so that she would be aware that that's where I really wanted to take her. Now, my mom, as I mentioned, her name's Rosalind. She'll be 90 this year. She is a conservative Jewish woman. She was bat mitzvahed at the age of 66. She keeps a kosher home. And I had very many apprehensions about how we would fare traveling together for the first time, probably since I was about 10, and they took me to that Roosevelt Field shopping mall. In fact, as it turned out, my mother was a fabulous traveling companion. During our 2-week trip to India, in fact, throughout South Asia, I came to realize that it was she and not my restless, highly distracted father, as I'd long believed, who had bequeathed me the essential tools of a traveler. It was my mother who had demonstrated open-mindedness, an interest in everybody, a delight with every kind of food she was offered, from palak paneer to potato samosas. Mom made a wonderful impression everywhere we went, and she surprised me with her elan, her behavior, her openness to experience continually. I'll tell you one thing that happened. I love this little story. We went to a big festival at one of the Hindu temples in Delhi, and it was a gigantic festival for blessing children. One of the things they do to bless children at these festivals is they shave their head and paint swastikas on their shaved heads. Now, the swastika in the Indian religion is a sign of good luck. In fact, the word swastik means good luck. It was appropriated, talk about cultural appropriation. It was appropriated by the Nazis as their personal symbol, but it was actually an ancient symbol from the Vedic tradition of India. And at a certain point during that whole temple event, I looked around and my mother was gone. She had vanished. And the place was packed and there were people everywhere. And my mom was 75 years old at the time. And I went crazy. I just started darting from room to room looking for her. Where could she be? What should she be doing? And I came into this one sort of anteroom and I was astonished by what I saw. There was my mother, my devout Jewish mother, on her knees with her hands together, leaning over and her eyes closed, as a naked holy man was putting ash on her forehead. It just kind of demonstrated to me that my mother is up for anything. Another surprise kind of like that happened when we were at the Sas Babu temple complex near the city of Udaipur. Some of you might have visited. And these are 1,000-year-old temples covered with exquisite, beautiful carvings, although many of them were defaced by Mongol invaders hundreds of years after they were made. So there was a private craftsman, a young Indian man, who had set up a table near the entrance to the temple, who set up a table near the entrance to the temple complex. And he was selling these small abstract statues of the god Ganesha, the god of auspicious beginnings, protector of writers, remover of obstacles. So I ducked into one of the temples, and when I emerged, my mom was bargaining with the vendor for a Ganesh statue. And I was absolutely astonished. I mean, one of the first things you learn in a strict Jewish household is that idolatry of any kind is strictly forbidden. And here was my mother, succumbing to what I had come to call the golden calf syndrome, which is a kind of a love of statues and idols that Jews get when they sort of go to India and Nepal and see all these beautiful figurines of the Buddha and Avalokiteshvara and Ganesha. But I never dreamed that my mother, who lights Sabbath candles every Friday night, would fall victim to the golden calf syndrome. So I just came up to her and I grabbed her arm. I said, "Mom, what are you doing buying this Ganesh? You're actually buying yourself a Hindu deity." "It may be a deity to you," she said serenely, accepting the wrapped elephant god. "But to me, it's only a souvenir." Let's see. I think we may have time for one more story, but I'm not sure. How is it looking out there?
Go for it, Jeff.
One more story?
Yes.
Nikon? Okay. Oh boy. Give me a second here. All this stuff just fell down all around me. And I can't find my note. I might have to go to my actual book, unless you want to pick another one. Let's see. Nikon. Where are my notes on the Nikon?
You want to
Okay,
try another one?
I'll just tell you this little story. So this black Nikon is a Nikon I bought from a friend in 1979 before my first trip to Asia. It's a real working, beautiful, classic, non-electronic Nikomat, which is what they call these cameras in Japan, which is where this one was originally purchased. I bought it in San Francisco from a friend of mine who worked with me at the Exploratorium, which is a place some of you have probably visited. So I was trekking in the Annapurna Range in Nepal in September of 1979, going up and down the steep steps to the villages. You'll go up 3,000 feet in one day, then down 2,000 feet in the same day, then up another 4,000 feet on that same day. And it's really extraordinary how much distance and altitude you can gain and lose in the course of a single day's trekking. And you get kind of good at it. You get pretty good at this sort of like, jumping from step to step to step to step as you go down these long staircases. But at one point, as I was descending a long path of slate steps down from the village of Uleri to the village of Tatopani, I slipped on one of the slate tiles and I fell headfirst off the trail. Not to my right, where I would have sort of plunged off the mountain, but to my left, where there was a sort of an equally dangerous rock field of huge sheets of slate, kind of at angles, making V's with each other. And I went sailing for about 4 feet right into the V of one of these stone nutcracker-like formations. And what happened is that as I went into this crevice, my Nikon camera rode up before me and got wedged into the rocks and then sheltered my head as my head came down on top of it, smashing into the prism case. And that camera is what saved my head from being crushed like a walnut during that fall. And if you can go back to the camera for a second, you can sort of make out on the top of it, that little dent, that little white square on the top of the camera, where my chin hit it and dented it. That was the only thing that happened to the camera. It worked beautifully well for the rest of the trip. And I'm just going to wrap up this story without notes by saying that I often, look at this thing, which I'm giving away, with some apprehension, because I'm well aware that my current camera, which is an iPhone 7, would be very unlikely to do me the same favor. That was super short. It's 1:45. Do we have time for one more? Or should we just jump to questions and answers?
do you want to do one more? Because we're loving this and the comments in chat are echoing that.
Well,
They're wonderful.
it's up to all y'all. I mean, I would do another one, but I don't know which one's going to come up. And it may
I
be
think,
one that's in a
yes.
pile on my floor at this point.
Okay.
See if we can find it. I will read this next one rather than try to perform it, so we'll get through it well. Oh, okay. This is the dolphin tooth necklace from the Solomon Islands. So let's see. Do I have a way to find this? Keep looking at that object for a while. Do I have this one? I am going to find this in my book, I think, and read it to you, because this is a really wonderful story. It's one of my favorites, but it's not a story that I just feel like telling from my notes. So I'll ask you to hold on for me for a second while I find the story in the book. It is under the travel section, I think. It might be under the spirit section. Okay. So this is a dolphin tooth necklace, which I got in the Solomon Islands in 1987. And you can stay on the necklace because I'm actually going to read this story to you. Come back to me if you feel like it, but just be aware that there are no tour buses in the Solomon Islands, no local wonders of the world, no towering temples or monkey dances at the ends of well-paved roads. Roads themselves, in fact, were scarce. It quickly became obvious that I would need to find my own way. So I was on assignment for Islands magazine, and I was sent to the South Pacific nation, which is composed of 1,000 islands. Nearly 100 dialects have evolved across the archipelago of islands, each spoken by a small, localized population. There's a powerful loyalty that exists among people who share the same language. They are called Wantoks, which is pidgin for one talk. So Wantoks are the people who speak the same language. Wantoks are like tribal kin in a place like the Solomon Islands. One Wantok will always help another Wantok out. So I knew that a writer of any nationality would qualify as one of my Wantoks. In the capital of Honiara, I met and befriended a local author named Julian Maka. He had just published a short story collection called The Confession, and his dream was to return to his family's village on the island of Makira and record the traditional stories told by his clan. His uncle Moses was a healer, it turned out. His great-grandfather was a kind of a mayor of Honiara. And Julian's mother, who was known as Sao, was one of Makira's revered mystics. She dream dances, Julian told me, and awakens to teach these dances and their enchanted songs to the village women. During the previous 10 years, Sao had brought more than 25 such dances and songs from the dream world to the island of Makira. There would be a ritual feast in the village in 3 weeks. Preparations were already underway. With Julian's blessing and his uncle's phone number, I took the inter-island flight to Makira and was welcomed as a guest in the tiny village of Julian's family. One night, Sao and the women of the village assembled to perform their dream dances for me. 18 women swayed beneath the stars, clapping and shouting in synchronous rhythm as Sao and 3 village elders chanted the mesmerizing songs. The dances were simple, but full of pantomime and innuendo that I simply couldn't understand. I was absolutely rapt for the first hour, enchanted for most of the second, attentive by the third, and kind of drifting off by the hour number 4. But the dances went on and on. The women began to giggle and lose their timing during the dances. Even the irrepressible Sao began to sound hoarse as she sang. Finally, Julian's uncle, who had accompanied me to the dances, understood the problem. He leaned over to me and whispered that, according to local custom, since I was the guest of honor, it was up to me to decide when the dances would end. They ended very shortly after that. I left the following morning with this lovely but somewhat disturbing necklace of dolphin teeth, my parting gift from the remarkable Sao. That's the end of that story. Well, I hope you've enjoyed those little stories. There's 116 of them in the book, 114 of them, and pictures of 108 of the objects. It's a wonderful little project, and I hope you get a chance to take a look at it sometime. Thanks for listening to the stories, by the way. It's always funny to do them on Zoom.
Jeff, those were phenomenal. Seriously.
Thank you, Len.
Really wonderful stories. Thank you. And we have some questions. So I'm
Sure.
going to go to the Q&A here. Okay. What's the most valuable object you've given away?
I would say that statue of Avalokiteshvara, with the story about the Dalai Lama getting my pen from under the couch, that was an antique wooden statue that was probably at least 100 years old and probably worth $3,000 or $4,000. And it ended up being claimed. One thing about the book is that if you buy a copy of the book, you can claim an object from the book for the price of shipping. And that object, the Avalokiteshvara statue, was claimed by two very serious Buddhist practitioner friends of mine who live in Flagstaff, Arizona. And if any of you have been to Flagstaff, Arizona, my friend owns one of the more famous coffee shops there, which is called Late for the Train. So pay him a visit and ask him about the statue.
Good story and good recipients, for sure. Okay. If you part with a beloved object, does that free you up in the future to take another one into your collection?
Hopefully not. The idea is to get rid of them. I'm still astonished when people give me objects as gifts. I mean, don't they understand that it's experiences at this point that I'm trying to collect, not objects? But they mean well. And when I become very good at the art of regifting. For instance, I'll be regifted something, for a holiday on Tuesday, and I'll find another person to give it on Thursday, and just kind of keep these objects in circulation out in the world. But no, it's not as if it frees up space for another object. Although objects do come, they do arrive. This is their nature.
And on that theme, someone says, as you got towards the end, choosing items to make that number 108, which one, if any, was the hardest to include?
The hardest one to include, that's a really interesting question. Some of them had stories that are very personal. And if you read the story about that object, there's a whiskey decanter, and there's a yo-yo. Some of them have to do with my personal life and my relationships, which have been difficult at times and have led to a lot of self-introspection. And those stories were difficult because I knew I'd have to write them. The weirdest object in the book, which was difficult to part with because I don't think anybody would want to take it, was a PICC line, a peripherally inserted catheter tube that had been run from my arm through and into my heart when I was in the hospital recovering from sepsis. Wow. And after that procedure, which lasted about 6 weeks, they removed the PICC line and gave it to me. And I had it sterilized, and that's one of the objects in the book, an object that has actually been inside of my heart. And the object was claimed, believe it or not, by my friend and the astonishingly wonderful writer and astrology columnist, Rob Brezhny.
Oh my goodness.
Who does free will astrology.
Wow, what a story that is. Wow. And someone asks about another one of your objects that they saw on the grid. What about the Frog King?
That's a can opener in the shape of a frog prince, a little brass can opener as a frog prince. And that story, which I don't really have the time right now to tell, except in very abbreviated form, is a story about a place called Guyana, the country of Guyana on the north coast of South America, and a trip I went there with my then girlfriend, Christina. And the point of that trip for me was to find the golden frogs that live in the it's not camellia. I can't remember anymore the name of the special kind of epiphyte flower that they live in. But these golden frogs are very rare. And I was on the search for one for the magazine assignment that I was on for the Los Angeles Times. And the story, I'll just wrap it up for you, although it's really cute. It's just really kind of short. Years ago, I tried to get the email name, Frog Prince 2010@gmail.com, and it had been taken. And at the end of the Guyana trip, our guide, this wonderful guy named Wally, who had found the golden frog for us, gave me his email number, and it was frogprince2010@gmail.com. He was the one who had gotten that email address. So everything sort of came full circle.
I love that. Okay, we have a couple more here. Someone wants to know, where is your favorite place that you've traveled anywhere in the world?
So many places are wonderful for so many different reasons. The place that I've gone back to the most, and I've come to consider a second home, at least for most of my life, was Nepal, a place I've lived on and off for more than 25 years during a period of my life. I've spent years living there, not consecutively, but in multi-month sections, and I really love Nepal. My second favorite country is much easier to get to, and that's Mexico. Every time I go to Mexico, I am absolutely enchanted by their artwork, by the weaving, by the culture, by the warmth of the people, by the food, by the music. I am in love with Mexican culture. And I just think that that is, next to Nepal, the place in the world where I feel most comfortable, most seen, and where I feel I have the most in common with the people in terms of their love of art, culture, and poetry and food.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks.
Someone would like to know, what was the hardest object for you to part with out of your collection?
Camera was pretty hard. The hardest object is one that didn't come up in the show, and in fact, the picture of it wasn't on the grid. It was the first real statue I bought in Nepal in 1983, which is a beautiful 2-foot high statue of a dancing goddess. And it's really, really beautiful. And that was claimed, and I have not sent it to him yet. I asked him if I could hold on to it for a couple more months, because it's just a beautiful, half-naked dancing goddess. And to me, the way women are portrayed in South Asian art, it's just reminds me that all women are goddesses. And it's a tremendously wonderful reminder to have in my apartment. But I said I would let go of it, and let go of it I will.
That's difficult. And I love that.
There are other goddesses.
There are other goddesses.
I'm talking to one right now.
Someone would love to know if you're leading any upcoming tours.
So next spring, I will be leading a Himalayan writers workshop trip to Kathmandu, which will be the first time I've been there since the pandemic. Last time I was there was in 2018. And that is with my friend James Hopkins and the writing coach, Lori Wagner, who's a wonderful writing coach. And it'll be, I think, an 8 or 10-day trip. We'll visit all the sacred sites, or many of the sacred sites in Kathmandu and its environs in the Kathmandu Valley, and write every day and share our stories and take photographs. I've done it twice before. It's absolutely wonderful. And then at another point, maybe this fall, it could happen, I'll probably lead a trip to Cuba.
Okay, that's incredible. And can people contact you at the same address that we have?
Of course, Jeff@jeffgreenwald.com. Yeah, any interest in the trips and the book and just staying in touch, that's the place to reach me.
Okay, perfect. Is there anything else you would like to say to wrap up?
Just that it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. You know, it's so funny, the limitations of the medium. One of the wonderful things about storytelling is watching people react to the story you tell them. And that was a privilege I didn't have during this particular episode. But I'm going to trust and have faith that you all had a pretty good time, and you forgive me my sort of flub ups, which is what happens when you're staring at yourself while you're trying to tell a story. But it was a great pleasure. It was an honor to do this for you and Kathleen and Robin, and I hope you'll invite me back someday.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to read you a few of the comments from the chat, which are saying, please tell more stories. Fascinating. Thank you so much. Fantastic storyteller. Thank you so much again. Wonderful, very informative and interesting presentation. So delightful. And there you go. On and on.
That's really wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so very much. Very generous of you.
Letting us travel with you was amazing.
Mashallah, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And now I will just tell everyone what's coming up because we'd love it if you come back. Let me make sure I have this on. I do. Okay. The Outdoor Art Club has a public webinar coming up next week. So that's Thursday, May 7th. The speakers are Shelley Dombrowski and Jean Giramonti from the Alzheimer's Foundation, the Alzheimer's Association, and they'll give an overview of the distinction between Alzheimer's and dementia, which is very cool because I have asked that question several times. And I think a lot of us want to know the answer to that. They'll be presenting the latest treatments and medical facts. They'll be discussing effective communication strategies and addressing hands-on care, best practices, and offering some resources for caregivers. You can sign up for this and all future public webinars by going to the Mill Valley Outdoor Art Club's website and just click on public events. You'll see it there. Thank you everyone for coming. I think that was a great time. So cool to get to travel with him. Hope you come back again, and many, many thanks for coming. Bye-bye.